Yeah, absolution, possibly. I'm a very lapsed Catholic, so I'm not sure about absolution and whether I can administer it. But we are. So the idea is to, what I would like to do is to ask people in here, so speakers, chairs in the first instance, but also of course anybody else who has been so carefully listening and taking part throughout the day, to throw at us quite quickly a couple of points, a couple of things that either you thought were particularly relevant, particularly interesting to you among what we have discussed, or indeed something that you thought we should have touched upon but that hasn't come up yet. I don't promise that we will be able to deal with all of those points necessarily today, but as I said before, we want to do more of these things. Maureen and I and Susan and others have been scheming quite a lot. Scheming is the active word that we use in these things. And we want to make sure that we do more events on translation, on writing and translation, on communication in all of the ways that we've spoken about today over the next few months, over the next years. So the things that you're going to bring out now are also going to feed in what we're going to be doing next. And indeed, the things that you've written in your questionnaires, and if you haven't, please do, but the things that you've written there and your emails, if they're there, we'll put you on a mailing list and we'll take those comments on board to think about where we go next. But first of all, throw things at us. And I'll take some quick notes, maybe try to group things if I have that sort of mental agility at this time of the day, and see where we get to. So, Doug, yeah.
Well, I've noticed that all the speakers today, I think they've all used the word translation and interpreting at the same time and seem to make no distinction between them. Now, I've been out of translation teaching for a long time. It may well be that things have moved on and that we don't anymore make a distinction between the two. I think that there is a distinction to be made, but not as big as we used to think it was. And I'd really like to hear from some of today's speakers what they feel about that distinction or non-distinction.
Okay, yeah. More? I'm gathering them now, then we'll tackle them.
You want a question or do you want a response?
No, I want questions. Well, questions or points. Questions or points you want to raise. Then we'll tackle them. Now let's make a list first.
Oh, I'd love to come back to Plato.
Yeah, okay. I'll put Plato on the list. But we can do a whole day on Plato and translation. We have a resident Neoplatonist in the Department of Italian and a resident Neo-Aristotelian. Therefore, that can be done.
That's even better.
Yeah. But Plato, anything else, John?
That'll do for the moment. It's like it's too ambitious.
Yes. Susan, you were starting.
Yeah, I've actually, one of the things I've written down here in my notes is the question that's come up and has sort of floated around, which is what many of the speakers seem to feel is a shift of emphasis and a rising interest in translation today. Why this change? Why is this happening? We've talked a bit around that, but that's one of my.
Any more?
Well, no, because I've got several, but they're all connected to that one.
Okay. Yes.
Connected to Professor Basman's point, I brought up the publisher as well. But I used to be in publishing, and I'm one of those hated editors actually. Worked on translation, and I was hated. My translator hated me with a passion. So I mean, like maybe a bit more about that whole, their involvement and the publishers, whether they have, and then also.
Yeah, it's just sort of relating back to what Susan said in her question. It was quite surprising for me to hear of all this sort of interest in translation as opposed to original writing in English. And if it is so, then why is it that there is just 3% of translations being published?
Okay. 3% question, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
yeah.
I think it's the most optimistic study which is done for Writers Without Borders, or Words Without Borders.
Yes. Yeah. Words Without Borders. Yeah.
Two questions from two different moments today. One is if you're able to pinpoint in what way translation accrues the text.
Yeah.
When you, for instance, now Gelati, who's one of the major writers of his generation, with 75 now, has devoted the last 10 years of his life translating Ulysses. So, what is doing this for Ulysses?
Mm-hmm.
And the second question has to do with what Katerina was saying this morning. I would like, if you go back to this, is I think there is a problem that we touched upon, but I think is very relevant with the role of English in the contemporary world, and what Katerina was saying about the need of making, particularly through, not Herrera, the second one was Anthony, to make these stories Italian. And if there is something that is characteristic of fascism and that is carried, and if we can use it as a test, the extent to which foreignness is translated, but in the sense of normalized in a culture. More or less what Katerina was saying, but if she can take that point further out of fascism and use it as a paradigm for reading other contexts.
Yeah. 1, 2, 3. Start up. I'll weave my way up. So Gillian, start from you and then I'll go up.
I'd like to ask some of the other translators here,
Yes.
some literary translators, if they have had dialogue with authors, living authors, whether they've had productive conversations with them, or perhaps more obstructions.
or love-hate or mostly hate relationships.
Well, we hope the hate comes at the end.
Well, I hope it comes at the start and then dissolves. Yes.
Mostly we've been looking at translating into our mother tongues.
Yes.
And I wonder if anyone translates into the other language.
Yes.
I know that I self-translate into Spanish and then work with a Spaniard to get it to say what I want to say. So I'd say the two things, the self-translation and the working, which way you translate.
Yes.
I'd like to.
Can I add my own little question to that, because it's very closely related, and it's something that I have been asked recently and I don't have an answer to. And that is, and it goes back in a sense to what St. Eric was saying this morning about, this classification of languages. There's the mother tongue, and then there's the rest, and then there's the ones we know and the ones we don't know. And I was recently asked by a young translator about the relationship and whether anybody's looked into the relationship between translation and not necessarily mother tongue, but what she called childhood languages. So languages that you encountered early on in life, but which are not necessarily your mother tongue, and to what extent, we do that. I think the question was also about to what extent that division, that subdivision between mother tongue, not mother tongue, is not sufficient, whether there's a much more complex map that we should be looking at than that. So if I can tag on to yours. Yes?
Mine might be a bit general, but I was wondering for people who write it and translate it, how the act of translating affects their writing, or if it affects their writing.
Yep.
Yeah, I have one addition to that.
Mm-hmm.
Now when English is the world language, as you said, and fictions and other texts circulate in English more rapidly and more efficiently than in other languages, many texts are written now in view of being translated.
Yeah.
So that works back into the language you might write. I write it in such a way that it is easy to translate. This kind of half commercialized, half marketed role of translation into major language, I think that's something which
because again, that's something that Emily Apter wrote very eloquently
yes,
about, but this idea
that
of...
ties in with you that translation kind of works back.
Yes.
And my second thing, and I mean, what I did this morning was say that the distinction between mother tongue and not mother tongue is not that relevant,
Exactly,
because
yes.
translation is a function, it is not a a thing apart from a language or something. But there was one thing which we haven't discussed. I discussed it in the break with some, which I think is interesting. When we talk about translation, whether complex or simple from one language, we talk about from a given text or a given point of departure, and then there's some kind of, it might be difficult, it might be enigmatic and so on, and there might be lots of silences in it, what have we. But then we try to create something which is not on paper yet, well, which will be in the translation. What about the other way around? That we have experiences for which we have no name. That we have to put it into language, and there's no language there. Is that a kind of translation process or not, and if so, how does it work?
Yeah, I'd like to take on this and maybe expand it a bit further. We talk a lot about creative writing and translating as a way of getting in touch with our own resistances. So I wanted to know how translating and writing, creatively writing, kind of may change the bodily experience, and how might change also the body, might feed into obsessions, my kind of, singer, writers or translators that then get obsessed by writing and translate a writer for 10 years, for example. So I'd like to know if there are experiences or someone might talk about how translation affect the body and affects the emotions we talk about, we mentioned the fact that once you translate, then you can go back, in a sense. There's something like a physical, actually, transformation. Yes. Can we say there's a physical transformation? Can we say that we change as people? And can we say when there are resistances also, how we resist from translating, or how translation can feed into, can be like a safe place to kind of, reverse our problems or whatever.
It's sort of therapeutic,
the
therapeutic element
yes,
that we were talking about this morning, which is interesting because you have both metaphors. There is that element of therapy that comes out, but there's also a long tradition, for instance, of writers writing about translation as sucking blood, vampirism, that kind of thing, from Bram Stoker's Dracula all the way to Banana Yoshimoto. There's this tradition of translation being seen as something that sucks you dry, somehow that kind of absorbs everything. So there's both of those. Anything else? I have a page for
tomorrow?
Yes, we'll take it till tomorrow. Well, it won't and it can't, but I think there are some that we can group together again, and certainly there is, there's a first group which is precisely about these different agencies and the relationships between publishing, editing, the interest and where that interest comes from, but also on the other hand, the infamous 3% question. So maybe we could start from that group and then move on and see, there are people in here who have very direct, though different experiences of the publishing industry. There are people maybe trying to get into there. So what can you tell us? What is your experience of that relationship and of the way? And then at the back of that there is Susan's question, the interest in translation, which interestingly seems to come, yes, from academic circles, if you want, from the academic side, but not only there. We were saying earlier with Maureen, Amanda, Sarah, that the interest at events like the London Book Festival, the interest that is there when public events are organised. So it's not just within the close circles of academia, it's beyond that. So any comments on that to start off? We don't have to find the solutions to these questions.
Well, the first observation is that it's not an even process.
Sorry?
I mean, because in Italy probably we translate 80% of the fiction, something like that.
Yes.
And probably in Britain, I remember there was something that Pete walked in, Pete Hareton from Serpent's Day who had a list of foreign authors, and he entered into a quarrel some 10 years ago where the Guardian replied, no, but there are translations, and in the first 100, the top 100 books sold that year, but I think could be any year, there was not, say, Kundera, Joshua, or any of the authors that have been so I think the first observation to make is that it's very uneven. Obviously, countries that are not English-speaking are translating an enormous amount, and it's very rare. And probably DAC, as a publisher or as a near the could be. I think you're the only list, probably one of the few publishers publishing in translation.
Amanda, your hand is up.
With respect, Donna, I think things have changed almost incredibly over the last dozen or 15 years. I mean, when I first went to work as the first international literature officer at the Arts Council, nobody was interested in literature translation. There was nothing happening, absolutely nothing happening. And the first thing I did was revive the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize, which had died a death, and put proper money into it. And then the next thing was to work with the different language groups in London, because there seemed to be a total mismatch between the education system and the modern languages taught there, and the 342 languages that we know are spoken in primary schools in London. And they don't coincide at all. And if you want to do your GCSEs in Somali or Yoruba or any of the main languages that are spoken, you have to do it independently. There's no schools that will accredit you. And we know now what's happened with modern language teaching, having gone the same way as classical language teaching before then. So the main changes around the whole literary translation sector have, I'm ashamed to say, not been through the education sector at all in my experience. Much, much more grassroots, much, much more to do with these language groups getting on their feet and doing things. And one of the things I was proudest of when I very first started there in 2000, then we repeated it each year for, I can't remember how many years thereafter until I went to UEA probably, was that we supported modern poetry in translation, and we put together tours where the poets in translation were from the UK, and the tours went to cities with those particular communities in them. So you might have Turkish writing poets in North London, you might have Urdu writing poets in Leeds, and wherever, and you went to different regions, and you had the poets reading and saying their verse, and it was terribly funny because they were very, very passionate. You know, you'd get the Kurds standing on their seats and they'd be shouting responses to these poems that were, epic is not dead, oral history is not dead, legend is not, everything was alive. We're talking about time and everything being in the present. And then you get the English translator, who's usually an academic, sort of shuffling up but it was interesting, and it's changed dramatically. And I mean, I could bore for Britain on the subject of all the different things that we've set up. And the London Book Fair is one of the big successes. Free Word Centre is another, international translation day is another. Part of the circuit with the universities bringing in writers and translators from abroad is another. And when the Arts Council was drastically cut last year and lost 40% of its staff and decided to focus simply on one aspect of culture, instead of the 2% of their budget that they'd given to translation when I went in there in '99, they made over the whole budget to English PEN, which is an organisation for the defence of writers across the world. And PEN, through PEN, we now administrate the translation grants.
Translation is seen as central to the work of PEN, and that wasn't really so clear before.
That's right, and they're not just PEN books that are being supported, they're ones with a wider remit. And finally, and then I promise to shut up, we're doing a summer school in London at Birkbeck College. Their leaflet's downstairs, but half of the remit of the summer school, by popular request, the last two ones have been so successful, is that we give a session each day over to editing, because editing is so important, and the relations between writers and translators and editors is so crucial.
I'd like to add a little bit to that 3% question, which is very unhelpful after a certain point, because it's important to understand how diverse publishing is, first of all in the Anglophone world, and what sort of books are coming in translation. Now, both Amanda and I sat on the Foreign Fiction Prize board, so you have noticed that there are very, very interesting literary books coming in, and they have to be very, very good to fight their way in. and then there's an awful lot of rather interesting crime. So Eurocrime and so on and so forth. So you have, but again, it's interesting and it's challenging the commercial formats and formulas. You are, as publishing becomes more and more commercial, you also have translations coming in all of the other genres, and I mentioned zombie novels, I wasn't joking, right? So that kind of thing. But if you're going to measure the value of translation, it's not just a percentage, it's who's reading what. And our young writers who we teach here, who go into the poetry networks and the emerging fiction networks, they read from everywhere. They read from everywhere, and they read an awful lot of it in translation. And there's a lot of grassroots young writing is very, very performative. It's very, very social. So our students who are poets in London are going to 3-4 poetry readings every week, and then they have very interesting associations with poets from other parts of the world. And then there are these great arts projects, and those are the translations that are having an effect on our kind of literary culture here. And we sit inside a really commercial and increasingly commercialized and formulatized industry. But we're the interesting part.
I suppose that, sorry.
What I was going to say is I kind of agree with both Amanda and Maureen 100%. I think there are other signs. I mean, I think part of the work that certainly the two of them have done is I've noticed a quite clear change in terms of patterns of reviewing. We are now getting the name of the translator increasingly, and I think that's kind of consciousness raising. I mean, to talk about independent foreign fiction, I mean, 2 years ago when I did the Dublin Impact Prize, over 25% of all the books that came in were translations. And that's been pretty constant at 25 to 30% in the Impact Prize. But I think there's kind of other issues as well. I think when we look sort of, and I'm really glad the two of you have just said what you said, because I think when we look from within academia, we have a very narrow perception of what's going on. Because if you look at the success of international crime fiction, that's one thing. But if you may remember, Loredana, that Edwin Gensler he's actually just finishing a book at the moment on fiction about translations and translators, and has discovered, actually he reckons it's well up over 2,000 titles that he's found just in the last few years, because translation is intimately linked to notions of identity. So you've got questions of identity issues and belonging and all these things, and that tends to come out.
Well, it's incredibly common in all kinds of transnational writers, migrant writers, translingual writers. You find translation fictionalized constantly, and looking at Michaela, because she knows it as well or better than me, but that's one of those themes that constantly come up. And of course that ties back to some of the things we were saying also about self-translation. For instance, in those cases what you have are also processes which are less linear necessarily, and which don't go from source text. When we're talking about this linearity of the source text, which is already in some way sort of self-containing, concluded, published, present as an object, and then as a kind of afterlife, Benjaminian afterlife, but also as a kind of sort of afterthought, in a sense, translation comes along. You have all this writing where translation is an inherent piece of the practice. I'm thinking of the things that Ngugi has written about his own practice, where you may end up with two objects, but those two objects are so intimately related that it is impossible to say which one is the translation of which. So you have this incredible sort of composite grain of how translation infiltrates all of these processes, which goes beyond, in a sense, that kind of industry model that we may have sort of thought of, and the process you were talking about, the fact that there are these other routes through which translation emerges or through which people get to read things, etc., seems to me to go beyond just the case of the bestseller or the issue of the 3%, because again, 3% is also misleading in that it's 3% of how many.
It's changed.
Yes, exactly.
Since last month.
Yeah. But whatever it is, it's also the numbers that are relevant.
4.5.
Does that include computer manuals?
But the question of how...
So 4.5 of what? Sales?
Yes. Books published, are, no, I don't know about sales, but books published and now of fiction and
Is it just fiction?
Yeah.
no,
Fiction and poetry?
yes, fiction, poetry, fiction, whether in poetry or prose.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's 4.5%, which is a slight uplift. The bad news is that the other figure for, sorry, that was poetry, fiction and drama. The other figure, all the non-fiction stuff, the car manuals or whatever you want, cookery books, has gone down to 2.5%. So it's actually overall we're almost back where we started, but there is a rise.
But we can read the commanding manuals anyway. Yeah.
Yes, I've got Gillian and John. You, go ahead.
Just a point of information, I'm sure some of you are aware, but it's a very useful source of information when we're talking about flows, translation flows across Europe, particularly Western Europe. And that is Rüdiger Wischenbart's annual Books in Translation report. He produced them at least 2008, 2009, 2010.
Yeah.
And it gives you a wealth of information about what's being translated, which way translations are going, and I don't think it surprises any of us to know which way the translations are generally going, but there are some revealing facts about the recent influx of novels and fiction from Eastern Europe, included in the latest report.
You can access it all through the Salzburg Global Forum website.
Sorry?
Rudi Wischenbach is another fellow of the Salzburg Global Forum, and they have a big website with links to his report.
I had John, then I'll come.
Yeah, so I was just wondering how we get some of these exciting new innovations to have an impact on the school system. I speak as the father of two teenage daughters at a local state school, and my older one passed a GCSE in French last year. Her knowledge of the language is completely non-existent. She's grown up in a house with books in a variety of languages. She reads, both of them read, but they don't read, they read British and North American authors. The one thing they seem to be interested in, which doesn't fall into that category, is Japanese anime movies, which of course they're watching dubbed into American English. But the somehow, I don't know what I've done wrong, what I did but the idea that something written in a foreign language or translated from a foreign language might be interesting to read is something completely alien to them. And that, I think, is the case with a lot of people in schools in this country.
But then that leads us also to that other issue of, what about, indeed, if there are solutions, or if we're looking for solutions, or if we're looking for improvements. I mean, one big question we have is precisely how do we connect better the academic side to what is happening elsewhere? Because there is, I agree with Susan, I think there is a sense in which sometimes within academia there's quite a narrow view of what is happening out there, and the connectedness, the roots that link us to publishers, to editors, to translators are not strong enough. And indeed, one of the ideas for today with Katarina was precisely to start looking at those roots, and indeed the work we've been doing with Maureen, with Amanda, been following them around to places, to meet people, so precisely in that way. But the other one is this big question of, okay, so what do authors have to do? And of course, one of the answers that you encounter is precisely this idea, and as I was saying, Emily Apter wrote about it, of people who write, or the idea of writing in view of translation into English. So this kind of translatees way of thinking of literature, which on the other hand goes exactly against what Maureen was saying this morning. Because if you go that way, what you're doing is assimilating that commercial logic. And it's the opposite of what Maureen was saying when she was saying, I read world literature, I read things that were not produced in that context precisely because these people don't have to work by these rules. They replenish my writing by doing something different. So there is that kind of tension there between the idea of, okay, as a young writer, for instance, do I have to write according to a certain, in brackets, recipe, there isn't a recipe, but a certain model in order to get into that market? Or on the other hand, is it much better to think about it in a different way?
I think that one of the things we're looking at here is the pressure, the pull of globalized industry, and there is so much money that can be made, there's so much fame that can be had, and it's all through the pressure of these types of formulas. And I think that's where we all feel it. and we should all, in my view, resist it. There's another problem, which is a lot of people are not writing to be translated. They don't want to wait for the translator. They come to creative writing programs in this country and in the US in order to learn how to write in English and skip. Yeah.
Skip it all.
If they come here, they fall into my trap, and I make them start writing in their original language. But if it's generally, this is what the globalized publishing market is doing, and I find that really, and if people are choosing to do this because they want
someone
to get
else
ahead.
wanted to respond. Angela, yes, and then I'll come to you.
Yeah. On both of those points, really. Firstly, on the question of the globalised translation markets,
Yes.
I think maybe one of the things we can do as academics is not be too elitist about that type of writing, insofar as there are some critics working with theories of globalisation of culture who would say that's actually quite interesting. It's not necessarily living, and it might be, but actually there might be some interesting strategies of resistance going on there that we can talk about. And I think there is a tendency within academia to say that that's only commercialised, it's not elite, and we need to maybe interrogate our own responses as well. And on the question of our channels to talk to publishers, I think that's a really interesting one, and I've done a bit of talking to publishers, and one of the things I've really noticed is, of course, they're not from a modern languages background like I am, and they don't think in terms of binaries, and I think that's the one that we've got to get away from, that actually they're not interested in, French English translation, they're interested in publishing a really good book, and they're not interested in the kind of the language pair thing, which I think, because so many of us come from a modern languages background, we tend to get stuck in that mode. And then actually they're not interested necessarily in the translation versus domestic binary either, because they market translations alongside domestic products.
They want good books.
They want good books. They don't
In brackets, whatever a good book might be for the publisher.
It costs more money, but actually in terms of marketing it, what I think publishers are very good at now is marketing translations alongside their domestic products. So I think looking at the publishers list as a whole would be a really interesting way forward.
I wanted to go back to academic translations. I think nowadays there is much more awareness of the dangers of not getting cultural references or something like that. I was thinking about a case, a very specific case in Australia, an Italian author, Rosa Cappiello.
Yes.
She immigrated to Australia in the early 70s, and she didn't know any English. She was very angry because she wanted to better her life, and she found herself in a ghetto. And she wrote her experiences of living the first 3 years in Australia in Italian. And she wrote with a very angry language and very heavy language as well, not standard language. And she was translated by a middle-aged academic Italian Australian, who obviously didn't get the cultural references. And her book, the translation of her book, became a classic. Has been translated in Australia, has been published in Australia as a classic, but what they know is not what she wrote, but what he translated. So, and what I found really strange was that the first translation was published in 1984, and then there was another edition a few years in the early 90s, and then the last edition was published in 2009, and it wasn't reviewed. I was really appalled.
But that in a sense takes us to one of Enrico's questions. That's, in that case you have a translation that appropriates a text with a certain agenda in a certain way, from moving from Italian into English. And Enrico was saying, okay, if you look at that opposite sort of view, the idea in fascist Italy, we need to make these things Italian. Now move out of fascism, move out of that kind of strong ideological cage in which this was done. But what is the value of appropriating? I mean, my own answer to that would be that it's very different if you were sort of appropriating. It depends on the relative values and the relative sort of power loads of those languages. But Caterina might want to answer that, and then we might want to go back to
Well, the case of children's literature is quite specific, really, but I guess the main issue there is the problem of otherness in translation and how we deal with the otherness, with the foreignness of the foreign text. And it's been an ongoing problem in translation studies. So I think, yeah, obviously in children's literature, the main problem is that for a very long time, children's literature was seen as a tool for teaching literacy and educational skills. So obviously the problem of presenting otherness wasn't even there. So a foreign book was simply translated in such a way to become useful to the target children. So I think in general terms for adult translations, this is also an issue, of course. What is the value of otherness in the translation? What is the translation trying to achieve? And this goes also back to Scopus theory that you mentioned earlier. So what is the aim of this translation? To give us a sense, a feeling, an understanding of a foreign context, or to give us a beautiful book in our own language, full stop.
Or to tame it.
Or to tame it, of course, in the process of appropriating it.
Got a couple of people who want to comment.
I'm Savannah from Warwick. If it makes you feel better, Constant Garnett translated 70 books of Russian classics into English, and all of them are slowly being retranslated now because she raised to a level of a trusted translator in English literature for Russian literature. So whatever Tolstoy was saying in Russian was absolutely what Constant Garnett was saying. Whatever Turgenev was saying in English was through her. So, you know, it's not an isolated case from that point of view, and the functionality of translation, the success of translation, what happens when we introduce a writer or a poet into a different language, into a different medium, you know, the case of those Persians that needed a little art, of which Susan talks in her book, through Fitzgerald's translation, all of that is still valid, I guess.
Well, that's what Constant Garnett was always accused of doing, that Turgenev read just like Tolstoy, just like Dostoevsky. But everybody read them like Constant Garnett. But I mean, what was good was that she actually wanted to bring them into English. What was bad was that she didn't know any Russian. You know, she was a good communist, she was a Bloomsbury, she had chutzpah. She's the only literary translator I know of who has a biography written of her. So she was a very significant person. Boy, do they need retranslating.
There's a biography of Dorothy Sayers.
Yes, that's true.
Oh, but she wasn't just a translator.
No, I suppose that's true. All right.
No, I mean, nor was Frances Partridge. I mean, there are lots of people who've done
This goes back to translators as VIPs. I was also thinking of VIPs as translators, and I promise, honestly, if I had lots of money, I would get Eddie Izzard here. But apart from that, Vedita.
I'm sorry, I mean, this is probably going back a bit to this whole notion of otherness. What I study is Indian English fiction, mostly, and that itself is often viewed as translation because you're writing about India, where there are so many Indian languages in English. I mean, I don't subscribe to the view that Indian English writing is translation, but there is a school of thought that says, this is a colonial language, and you're writing about people who aren't speaking that language, so there's necessarily someone, or people who aren't speaking that language in your novel anyway, because if you were writing about people who speak English, then you're writing about some very niche elite group, and your writing is not interesting anyway. So, there's an act of translation going on while you write. And then people like, people I was talking about this morning, Gopal, Gandhi, and Karthikeyan, claim to untranslate that by writing it in some, Indian languages in which they're originally meant to, they're meant to originate in a sense. Yes. So, there's a whole, who's the other now?
It's a very complex, exactly, and that's
Pinocchio.
where
I mean, Katerina mentioned Pinocchio this morning, and I was thinking it's going to be
I tried to intervene a little before, but the discussion is very lively now, which is wonderful.
I have the next batch of questions. I don't think we'll ever get to Plato.
No, it's coming back to that school issue, an education issue, which I think is very important. And also just to comment a bit upon these translatees you were talking about. I think today it's not a translatees, it's a mediatees.
It's a
mediatees, because novels are written in order to be turned into TV series also. And I mean, I know that Danish and Scandinavian crime fiction is so popular in English, and it's so original, it's so local, it's so different. Friends, it is not. I can tell you how it happens. You are producing a TV series crime fiction or whatever for Danish TV, and they did that a couple of years ago. And then they tried to go on the market to have a price. And they got an American price. And then the head of the whole production was pulled aside. Said, well, you have to learn something, because if you really want to do the world, you have to change the plot a bit, or maybe the lighting, or maybe the way you cut, and the dialogue. There are so terribly many words in those kind of. Why can't you just make one-liners for all of them? Then really snapping and so on. So what happened was that some of those guys went to the States to learn how to do things, and then they went back with another good advice, namely, add a little local color to it. Just names, just something, and then you are there, and that's what you see in British television now. And it's very popular, so the success is there. So it's mediatees, not translatees. But about the school system, I think there's a difference between the educational system in a major language zone like the British one. And if I'm blunt, I will say there's a certain imperial provincialism over it. If you go to the small languages, in that respect, like my own, or as you say, in Italy you have so many translations on the series, the situation is a bit different. I tried a couple of years ago, that's what I'm trying to give as an advice here. I was there was a major high school reform, and I was involved in some interdisciplinary parts of the high school reform and the teaching of Danish, which corresponds to the teaching of English, of course, here. And what we did, and what we succeeded in doing, was to make it compulsory that within the Danish classes, you had to read world literature and translation. A certain amount, and of course a big freedom to the teachers, but it's very important that these aspects come into the English respective Danish classes and not in the French or German and so on. So that it's part of learning your language to know that through translation, the Danish language, the Danish culture, whatever, is part of a changing world culture. It might be contemporary world literature, it might be classical, whatever was taken out. Then I wrote, together with colleagues, a new literary history to go with that of Danish literature. It was not called Literary History of Danish Literature. It was called The History of Literature in Denmark. This is totally, and the difficulties was not, there was a financial difficulty, because after 2008 the high schools had no money to buy new books. That was not very good, but we're trying to do something about it. But the problem was not to convince the students about that, because they're living in this world with the Japanese. That was to tell the teachers how to do it, because they were teaching Danish, for Christ's sake, or English or French and German. And then, on the other hand, also to convince people teaching teachers of English, of German, English too, and French and so on, to respect this four-level kind of strata which Susan proposed, that if you want to teach to teach a foreign language, the knowledge about the context is just as important as knowledge. So it's not about reading French novels, it's about getting interested in reading French novels. And if you read it in French, you can hardly do more than 2 small novels through 3 years of high school. Much better to read fewer texts in French of that kind and then read things in translation. For instance, together with the teacher of Danish in a kind of combined way. So we get the interest in the foreign cultures. But it's two things. It's a re-education program for teachers to be accustomed to teach their national language specialty in a larger context. And what that means, translation is one of the things that it means. And second is to work with the ministry about the curriculum. Because you have to change the curriculum.
I have to say, and I'll use my privilege here to close this and then move on to the next bit, but I have to say that in that sense, I think that within universities we can do a lot.
Yeah,
because, for instance, I am utterly surprised every time I see that there is another academic history of Italian literature, French literature, whatever, Danish literature, written. And when you look at it, it doesn't include translation. And I find it bizarre, because it continues to propagate this idea that literature somehow lives and exists in isolation,
Yeah.
which blatantly it doesn't and it didn't.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
that's
Never done so.
But I've got two other sets of, apart from Plato, whom I think we know. But we'll think about Plato. For,
I can have that dialogue with myself.
Yes, exactly. we can have a dialogue about it. We can at night, we can, you know, facing our own sort of monsters, we can all think about Plato. And shadows, exactly. But I have two issues here that I would like to get to. One is the question that we were posing about, you know, mother tongue, non-mother tongue, and then how does that intersect with other things like self-translation or, as I was saying, you know, childhood languages, for instance. Are there other ways that we should be thinking about the question of language with translation? And then I've got a group of questions in here that have to do somehow with the experience of writing and translating. And they go from, you know, how does translation improve texts, but also how does translation affect your own writing, and how does translation even affect your own embodiment, your sense of who you are, and your sort of points of resistance, and also, do you have a dialogue? You know, is there a dialogue in a sense between the translator and the author? Is there a connection there in that experience? So I've got those two. I'd suggest that we start with this group and then we leave the question of language last. But anything about these questions about the experience of translation and how it connects with these other areas? Do you feel very strongly that translation has improved texts in your experience? Or anything else, Amanda? You.
Sorry, I thought the other question.
Start from wherever you want. Start wherever you want.
Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah.
with self-translation, I think we always hear the same names come up when we talk about self-translation, and it's always, you know,
It's
Beckett,
Nabokov, it's
Nabokov, Conrad, and so on. We can all make our own little lists. I had a whole list in the paper I didn't give. And I think when you look at it, they all have the same problem and the same solution, which are the same thing, of course, as a contemporary Welsh poet, Mana Elfyn, that some of you might know, who will not self-translate because her first language was Welsh. That to her is the language of poetry. She can write a poem in Welsh, she can write a poem in English, but she can't translate her Welsh poem into an English one because she has a special relationship with that language and she feels very passionately about it. Quite happy for professional translators to translate her. And what, you know, Beckett, Celan, and all the rest we've mentioned did was, of course, to just create a new poem. And they're very, very different, the original and the translation. And it's always this great game to go backwards and forwards and say which was the first one, but because they're different poems, there's an equivalence between them. And I'm not sure I'm convinced by the whole self-translation thing for that reason. Plus the fact, you know, there are other variants. I mean, I think the thing with Conrad is extraordinary and in a way hilarious that, you know, of course he taught himself English, and he taught himself English as a literary language before he ever spoke it, even at sea. And so when he managed to meet H.G. Wells, when, you know, he landed on the Essex coast and come up to London and tracked him down and said, you know, I'm a writer, I must read you my story, and read him a story. Wells said he couldn't understand a word because his English was so badly inflected, he didn't know where any of the accents went on the words, because English doesn't have any accents, obviously, and it was incomprehensible. So this whole idea that you have to be able to read your work aloud and listen to yourself and create yourself, if you can't read the language that you're writing in, that makes it very interesting. So I think it's more complicated than that. You could probably do a whole thing on self-translation with half a dozen writers and the appropriate experts.
But I think, I think that's a very narrow view. I'm thinking much more, you know, along the lines that Benita was talking about, where there is that element of translation which is deeply, inherently built into the text. The text wouldn't exist without processes of translation going on even before it's on the text, and at that point any translation almost becomes a retranslation precisely. And the idea that you could untranslate it goes back to what Enrico was saying, once it's done, can you untranslate it? It's an interesting one. But I think my view would be much broader than that, and I agree, if you keep it that narrow, then self-translation is a very
peculiar.
No, I think you have to
thing.
anchor it in something,
Yes,
and you
yeah.
have to look at what you mean by self-translation,
Yes,
and then
yeah.
there's a whole panoply that you can look at and see what you think you do mean.
But then exactly, if you open it, then there's a whole question also of what we define, you know, again, going back to what you were saying this morning, what we define as a mother tongue, and that sort of traditional, sort of stable thing. Angela and then Enrico.
So just a very quick example. I've done a bit of work on a French writer called Agnès Desart, who you may be familiar with, who is actually a translator into English. She's translated Virginia Woolf, I believe, into English. And there's a lovely interview with her where she's asked about...
yes, into French.
Sorry, it's French. What did I say? Late in the day.
No, it's an interesting idea. It's an interesting idea.
Interlingual translation.
Out of the stream of consciousness.
She's asked in an interview about the relationship between translation and writing, and she says that translating for her is like the bar for a dancer. It's completely indispensable for her own writing. And yet she doesn't translate herself, so even though she writes in French and her texts have been translated into English, they're translated by someone else, so she's not a self-translator, but nonetheless she feels that translation is crucial to her own writing practice. And she gave a presentation at Jewish Book Week a couple of years ago that I went to, and she, interestingly, her translation wasn't present, but she read from the translation of her text, which she read in English. So there's some very interesting negotiations going on there, I think.
I think it's very interesting because also for some writers it's quite rigid, that distinction. For others there's a fluidity between the languages that is exactly what they're playing with. So and there's all the colours in between, obviously, all the shades of grey that go between those.
And she has other languages in her background as well, not only English.
Enrico, you?
Yes, I think that the core here is intimacy. And I think of the Vulgare Eloquentia that begins with this idea that you have to write in the language of the mother, of la lingua della nutrice, which is, I think, staying with the fact that I think the real source is the act of doing it. But certainly there is a point there that it is very interesting if you think of Beckett. Beckett has a wonderful anecdote. You know, he had a very violent mother, and the father left. You know this story. And he had this wonderful anecdote that said, I didn't have an unhappy childhood because after all, my father didn't beat me up, my mother didn't leave. So turn it into, and the fact that he begins to write in French, and he says, I write in French because I have no style in French, is pitching it. The question on the question of intimacy, getting out of your mother.
I have heard a number of
sorry, just another point, and then I finish. And because the thing, and I think I'll try to address also what John was saying before, the fact, how does the language come back to you, and how do you? There is one thing that I fear more, or at least for, but not only for myself, human beings, that is worse than prejudice, which is the judgment you give on people you do not know, and is the horror of the people you know. Do you understand? I mean, the reaction of ingrata patria, as we say, the fact that you react to your own language, to your native language, with a sense of saying, oh, and you read all the class connotations, everything. You can read even too much into it. And I think this is where Beckett begins. He begins at that very point when he manages to get on top of all this endless quarrel that probably was going on with himself, with horror, attraction, and blah, 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 and he gets on top of it, and writing is a purposeful act of addressing, of going out, of going towards that. And I think I feel that a lot. I mean, I write in Italian with a sense of danger, and I know that is where...
That is interesting, because what I was going to say is that talking to a number of writers who have chosen to write at some point, I don't know, you know, to what extent one could say permanently, because it's never permanent until they're writing, until they stop writing, you know. So, but to writers who have decided to write in languages that are not their first language, exactly their mother tongue. And talking to them, there are two stories that tend to emerge, sometimes together, sometimes separately. And one is about, not so much about intimacy, but about experience. And so I've heard a number of them saying, well, I am living in this culture now, I am living in this language, the experience that I have, the people that I encounter, the relationships that I form, the stories that I hear are in that language. And so my sort of need to write is to write in that language because that's the language of my experience. And then the other story that I hear is more about a bit the Beckett thing. The idea of the discipline that is imposed, but also that little bit of distance that is imposed by writing in a language which is not the lingua della nutrice. That sense of not so much of intimacy, but of control, that you can do things with this language and you're actually doing it, as opposed to that language speaking you, in a sense. The weight, I remember Ornella Borzi saying, you know, in Albanian every word has got the weight of a stone. It carries years and years of memory. When I write in Italian, it's painful, it requires a lot of discipline, but I feel much more that what I'm doing is what I'm doing, rather than, you know, that kind of, either I put my feet into a very old pair of slippers and sort of it's comfortable and it's fine, or it's so heavy emotionally, it's too much. So it's interesting because those narratives also come out a lot. So it's a tension, I think, between these things that is happening all the time.
Sorry, can I just ask something here? But doesn't it sometimes also depend on the experience that you're writing about? For example, I'll give you one example. My sister and I, we live in England. When we speak home, we speak in French because that's whatever the mother tongue if you like. But you know, if we start speaking about, I don't know, some religious rite, some tradition, we'll switch to Bhojpuri because that's the language of tradition. And then we'll speak about work, and we can't speak about our work in any other language than in English. So even when I'm writing an email to my father, it depends on, you know, whether I'm talking about my work, I write in English. If I'm talking about something I need to ask my mother, it'll be in French. And then if I'm talking about whether I'm being romantic or whatever, it'll be in Hindi because that's the language of Bollywood and the popular culture I know. So it's, I mean, like, for me, language is a, you know, compartmentalized.
And that goes back to what I was saying earlier. Maybe, you know, that classification isn't really that useful. And I keep quoting you know, Maria Timoshko, who in one of our articles just a few years ago was writing about, okay, what about this, you know, this convention that the majority of people worldwide are monolingual? Actually, start counting. And yes, you know, my experience of language, and for me it's interesting because I was, if ever there was a monolingual in a sense, I was a pretty perfect little monolingual as a child, in the sense that I grew up in Italy, in Tuscany, in a sort of lower middle class family. So as near as you can to not being bilingual in Italy, in the sense that there was hardly any dialect around me, for instance.
Well, you do
no
speak a
speakers.
dialect there.
Yeah, but honestly, you know, even within Tuscany, I was, you know, I was that middle class lower where you don't use it that much, so that kind of quite controlled. So I'm not saying the Tuscans don't have a dialect. I'm saying that where I was, it was quite, you know, it was quite reduced. And then no speakers of other languages in my family, everybody, you know, not a bit of French, English, or anything else. And yet, you know, if you look at me now, indeed, my behavior is exactly like yours. I start anything, you know, the shopping list, it starts in one language and it continues in another, and by the end it might have three.
Exactly, yeah.
So it's an inspiration to us all, because I interviewed a Turkish writer with the unlikely name of Mario Levi a week or so ago. And he was lamenting the fact that, you know, his language of home was Ladino because of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, that the language of the street for him was Turkish, the language of education was French, the language of shul in the synagogue was Hebrew, and his daughters just learn English. That all the back history now is going, that the next generation, English is the global language. Within Europe, most school kids, apart from British ones, learn 2 foreign languages, one of which is always English, because secondary education and most of the tertiary education is so often through English now. But if you look at the charts in the hallway, the entrance to the British Council, it shows, for example, a country like the Czech Republic, 96% of children learn 2 foreign languages or more at school, and in Britain, it's 6% learn 1 language apart from English at school. I mean, it's absolutely appalling.
Yeah, but what about China? Is there any sort of monolingualism there?
Well, no, I mean, they're learning, I mean, you can go to Mongolia and the borders, it says our second language is English.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's China is as much English speaking as everywhere else.
And
But
again,
there is,
China's not a
Mandarin.
monolingual country, let's remember that, because it's not, it's far from being a monolingual country in itself.
No, but Mandarin is very dominant, and of course outside China's borders, which are vast enough, there's not a huge amount of Mandarin spoken except in the diaspora.
Well, there is the statistic about how there are more speakers of English in China than there are in the United States.
Yes, yeah. Okay, well, I feel that we have covered quite a few things. We haven't covered all of them, but I think we ought to probably bring it to a close. So I'll close this, I think, and I'll invite Katerina to come and close it more formally and with her comments. As far as I'm concerned, I'll close it with A, beware of the monolinguals, they're funny people, and B, please go away and think of Plato.
No, don't think of Plato.
Or don't think of Plato. Katerina, do you want to come and close things? And then there will be drinks. I think we'll serve them up here, actually, rather than downstairs.
Just
so we'll be,
outside, yeah.
there are tables outside and we'll serve them up here.
Okay, well, I feel like it's very difficult to wrap it all up because first, so many things have been said, and second, I feel like we could go on until tomorrow morning. But this is wonderful. I think it's a very good sign that a forum like this, where writers, translators, editors, publishers, and scholars of all kinds get together and talk about these themes, is much needed. And I really hope it will continue in the future in many more events such as this one. I just wanted to make a final comment about something Susan said about how we are getting into the textual analysis again after a period of time when this was probably dismissed. And I think it's especially thanks to translation studies as a discipline, because I really feel as a young scholar that now we have so much theory, so many tools, and we are eager to use those tools and apply them to the text, while before those tools were still being polished and created. So this is one thought that I had. And the second comment that I wanted to make, again, talking about the importance of translation studies as a discipline, is that I really think because of the rise of translation studies, this really promoted the importance of literary translation and the growing interest in literary translation that we see around us. I think it's directly linked to the growth of translation studies. Maybe it's not so obvious because we don't always feel that the link between scholars in translation and translators is so explicit, but I still think that because translation studies is a discipline, is taught at university, this has created a web of institutions and institutional interest around it, and so it's being promoted more widely, and of course we are very happy about it. So thank you to you all for coming. It's been a wonderful day, very inspiring, very stimulating. And I think we are ready for a glass of wine.
Yes. Thank you.